June 16, 1822, 11:47 p.m. A back room in the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Anson Street, Charleston, South Carolina. Denmark Vesey stands before 130 black men, candlelight flickering across their faces. Carpenters, blacksmiths, house servants, dock workers. In his left hand, a Bible open to Exodus 21, verse 16. He that stealeth a man and selleth him shall surely be put to death. In his right hand, a hand-drawn map of Charleston's armories, with every guard position marked. His voice drops to a whisper. Tomorrow at midnight we take the arsenal on Meeting Street. By Sunday morning, 9,000 of our brothers and sisters walk free, or we die trying. Outside the sound of horses, boots on cobblestone. Someone's face goes pale. A man near the door mouths the words, "They're here." Within 48 hours, 131 black people arrested. Within 2 months, 35 hanged, including Denmark Vesey himself. The church building razed to the ground, every brick scattered. Every record of the plot sanitized by authorities. For 200 years they called it a slave conspiracy, making Vesey sound like a criminal, a madman, a threat to civilized society. But what they buried was the truth. This was the most sophisticated liberation movement in American history before the Civil War. It was planned in a church, led by a minister, inspired by the Bible and the Haitian Revolution. And it almost worked. What happened next wasn't just execution. It was erasure so complete that most black Americans have never heard Denmark Vesey's name. Until now. Everything you learned about Denmark Vesey, if you learned anything at all, was a lie designed to protect white supremacy. They taught you he was reckless, irrational, a danger to himself and others. They never told you he was a genius. They never told you he spoke 5 languages. They never told you he turned Bible study into military training. They never told you he recruited 9,000 people across every division. Slavery created field slaves and house slaves, skilled craftsmen and dock workers, free blacks, and the enslaved. They never told you he almost freed an entire city. By the end of this video, you'll know how Denmark Vesey, a free black man with money and safety, risked everything to free people he didn't even know. How he used scripture as a blueprint for revolution. How he built an army in plain sight while white Charleston slept. How the AME Church became headquarters for black liberation. How white Charleston responded with such brutal terror that they banned black churches for decades. And why this story was buried so deep that 3 generations grew up never knowing their ancestor was a revolutionary warrior. This isn't ancient history. This is 1822, your great-great-great-grandparents' lifetime. If you have roots in South Carolina, Georgia, anywhere in the Low Country, this is your story, your inheritance, your legacy. And after today, you'll never see your church the same way again. Let me tell you who Denmark Vesey really was. Born in 1767 on the island of St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies. Birth name, Telemak. Enslaved at age 14 by Captain Joseph Vesey, a slave trader who worked the Caribbean routes. For 20 years, young Denmark sailed those slave ships, witnessing horrors that would break most men. He saw children ripped from mothers' arms. He saw men and women chained in their own waist in shipholds, designed to pack maximum human cargo. He saw bodies thrown overboard when disease swept through. He saw the Middle Passage up close again and again, voyage after voyage. But he also saw something else. In 1791, when he was 24 years old, the ship docked in Haiti just as the revolution was beginning. He watched enslaved people rise up against the most powerful empire on earth. He watched them defeat the French, then the Spanish, then the British. 3 European armies crushed by people who had been in chains months before. That image burned into his mind. Black people winning, black people free, black people victorious. In 1799, something changed. Denmark bought a lottery ticket on East Bay Street in Charleston. The prize won $500, equivalent to $35,000 today. He won. With $600, he purchased his own freedom. With the rest, he built a life. He changed his name to Denmark Vesey, settled in Charleston, opened a carpentry shop on Bull Street. By 1820, he'd accumulated substantial wealth, property worth somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000. He was successful, respected, safe. He married multiple times, had children. Under South Carolina law, those children by enslaved women remained property, even though their father was free. A free black man's children were still slaves. Denmark Vesey could have lived quietly, comfortably, invisibly. He chose war instead. Here's what made Vesey different. He was self-educated, taught himself to read, using whatever books he could find. He learned English, French, Spanish, Creole, and could read passages in Hebrew. He read everything about the Haitian Revolution he could get his hands on. He studied Toussaint Louverture's military tactics. He read Thomas Jefferson's words about liberty and equality and asked why they didn't apply to black people. He studied the Bible obsessively, could quote scripture for hours. In 1817, he joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. Within months, he became a class leader, teaching Bible study twice a week. But Denmark Vesey wasn't teaching the gospel of patience and obedience that white ministers pushed. He was teaching liberation theology. He opened to Exodus and said, "This is us." He opened to Joshua and said, "This is our battle plan." When other teachers quoted, "Go ye back into bondage in Egypt, for I, the Lord, had rather you should," Vesey would explode with righteous fury. No, God commands you to be free. The Lord does not want you in chains. He turned Wednesday night Bible study into something white. Charleston never imagined. A school for revolution. Let me give you context for what Charleston was in 1820. The black population approximately 14,000 people. The white population approximately 10,000. Think about that. Black people were the majority in one of the wealthiest cities in America. But enslaved people had zero rights, zero power, zero protection. Even free blacks like Vesey faced brutal restrictions. Curfews after 9 p.m. Couldn't testify against white people in court. Couldn't gather in groups larger than 7. Needed written permission to travel outside the city. Charleston's entire economy ran on rice, cotton, and indigo, all grown by enslaved labor on plantations surrounding the city. The wealth was staggering. Charleston had more millionaires per capita than anywhere in America. Every brick in every mansion paid for with stolen black labor, and the white population lived in constant paranoid fear that one day the numbers would matter. One day black people would realize they outnumbered their oppressors and rise up. Denmark Vesey did the math. If we organize, we win. But here's what made his decision so profound. Vesey was free. He had money. He had a business. He had a life. He could have kept his head down and survived. His children, though his children were still enslaved despite his freedom. South Carolina law said children follow the condition of the mother. No amount of money could buy their freedom because the white masters who owned their mothers refused to sell. He watched his own children grow up in bondage while he lived free. That contradiction poisoned him. He saw families ripped apart at slave auctions every single day in Charleston's market on Chalmers Street. He saw enslaved people whipped in public squares for the crime of looking a white person in the eye. He knew the violence intimately from his years on those slave ships. He knew what America was built on. But the breaking point came in 1818. Morris Brown, the pastor of the AME Church, was arrested along with 140 other free blacks, their crime disturbing the peace. What they actually did held a church service without white supervision. The church was raided, temporarily shut down. Free black people arrested for worshiping God in their own building. Denmark Vesey looked at that moment and understood. Even freedom wasn't safe. Even worship wasn't protected. Even with money and status, white supremacy would never let black people exist in peace. So he made a decision. If we can't be safe, we'll be free. And if they won't give us freedom, we'll take it. Vesey began recruiting in 1821. Quietly, strategically, brilliantly. He started with men he trusted absolutely. Peter Poyas, a ship carpenter, became his second in command. Peter was a tactical genius, cool under pressure, absolutely fearless. Rolla Bennett enslaved by Governor Thomas Bennett himself. Think about that irony. The governor of South Carolina's own slave, plotting to overthrow the government. Ned Bennett, Rolla's brother, also enslaved by the governor. Both men had access to the governor's mansion, heard conversations, knew security details, understood the routines of Charleston's most powerful men. Monday, Gell, a harness maker and Igbo priest who connected African spiritual traditions with Christian liberation theology. Gula Jack Pritchard, a conjurer born in Angola, a spiritual leader who could recruit among people who still practiced traditional African religions. Each of these men became a lieutenant. Each was assigned to recruit in different districts of Charleston and the surrounding plantations. The strategy was compartmentalized. If one cell was compromised, it wouldn't bring down the whole operation. Military precision. Their cover was perfect. Bible study. Every Wednesday night, black men gathered at the AME Church on Anson Street to study scripture. White Charleston saw this as positive. Good Negroes learning to be obedient Christians. They had no idea what was really happening in those back rooms. Vesey would teach from Exodus, from Joshua, from Judges, the warrior books of the Old Testament. He'd read how God commanded the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and child in Canaan. And he'd ask why that same God would want black people to submit to slavery. He'd quote Zechariah chapter 14 verse 2, "The day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee." And he'd say that spoil is the wealth stolen from us, and the day of the Lord is coming. The meetings looked like prayer. They were military planning sessions. The blacksmiths in the group and Vesey deliberately recruited skilled metal workers, began making weapons, pikes, bayonets, daggers, hidden in shops, buried in yards, stashed in the church basement. Hundreds of weapons forged over months. Vesey and Poyas mapped every arsenal in Charleston, the main one on Meeting Street, the guardhouse on Cannon Street, the powder magazine on Cumberland Street. They noted how many guards when shifts changed, which doors were weakest. They studied the layout of the city, planned 6 simultaneous attacks designed to happen so fast, white Charleston couldn't organize a defense. Group 1 would seize the Meeting Street arsenal and distribute weapons. Group 2 would capture the Cannon Street guardhouse and kill the guards. Group 3 would take the powder magazine. Group 4 would set fires across the city to create chaos and confusion. Group 5 had one job: kill Governor Bennett and the other top officials, make the head of the snake useless. Group 6 would seize ships in Charleston Harbor. If the revolt succeeded, they'd stay and hold the city. If it failed, they'd sail to Haiti, where Toussaint Louverture's revolution had created the first free black republic. They had an exit strategy. These weren't desperate men making reckless choices. These were strategists planning a military operation. The recruitment was sophisticated. Vesey's instructions to his lieutenants were clear. Don't trust house slaves. They have too much to lose. They're too close to their masters, too comfortable, too likely to inform. Target field workers, skilled laborers, dock workers, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Only recruit the committed. If someone seems uncertain, walk away. Security depended on secrecy. Use code words in public. Never say the word revolt or freedom or kill in any place where someone might overhear. If arrested, reveal nothing. Peter Poyas became famous for his statement, "Die silent, as you shall see me do." That was the standard. Take the secret to the grave. They recruited for over a year, from late 1821 through spring 1822. Estimates of how many people committed range from 6,000 to 9,000. Think about that number. 9,000 people keeping a secret. 9,000 people coordinating. 9,000 people ready to risk death for freedom. This wasn't a small conspiracy. This was an army hidden inside a slave society. The target date was set, Sunday, July 14th, 1822 at midnight, Bastille Day. The day French revolutionaries stormed the prison and overthrew the monarchy. Symbolic and deliberate. Vesey picked that date to connect their struggle to the global fight against tyranny. Everything was ready. Weapons distributed, attack teams assigned, signals planned. White Charleston had no idea they were sleeping on top of a powder keg. But then late May 1822, something happened. A house slave named George Wilson was approached by one of the recruiters. George wrestled with the decision for days. Join the revolt and risk death, or stay loyal to his master and maybe survive. On May 30th, he told his master, Colonel John C. Priolo. Priolo didn't believe it at first. Too big, too organized, impossible. But then another house slave came forward with the same story. Mayor James Hamilton Jr. was alerted. He acted fast, but carefully. If the authorities moved too publicly, they might trigger the revolt early. So they worked quietly, arrested a few people, interrogated them, tried to get names. On June 14th, the arrests accelerated. Dozens of black men rounded up. On June 16th, Denmark Vesey was arrested at his home on Bull Street. He knew what was coming. When the constables grabbed him, he didn't resist. June 18th, Peter Poyas arrested. Then Rolla Bennett. Then Ned. Then Monday Gell. Then Gula Jack. Within a week, 131 black people were imprisoned in the workhouse on Magazine Street, a building designed to punish enslaved people. The plot was over before it began. White Charleston had barely avoided what would have been the bloodiest slave revolt in American history. But the conspirators kept their oath. Most of them revealed nothing under interrogation. Peter Poyas stayed silent even when tortured. Denmark Vesey spoke only to defend himself with brilliance and fury. The trials were a mockery of justice. The Charleston Court of Magistrates and Freeholders convened. Not a real court. No due process. No right to legal defense. No cross-examination of witnesses. The defendants couldn't even hear the evidence against them. Testimony came from other enslaved people, extracted through torture beatings, promises of freedom if they cooperated. The trials lasted from June 19th through August. Denmark Vesey defended himself when given the chance. He quoted law. He quoted scripture. He exposed contradictions in the testimony. He argued that he was a free man, being tried for thoughts, not actions. What law have I broken? Planning to be free is not a crime. Show me the statute that says a free black man cannot think about liberation. The court didn't care. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in terror, making an example so brutal that no other black person in Charleston or anywhere in the South would dare dream this big again. June 22nd, 1822. Denmark Vesey sentenced to death by hanging. Peter Poyas sentenced. Rolla Bennett sentenced. Ned Bennett sentenced. Monday Gell sentenced. Gula Jack sentenced. 35 men total condemned to die. The governor, Thomas Bennett, had to sign the death warrants for his own slaves. Imagine that. Rolla and Ned had lived in his house. served his family, and now he signed the order to hang them. Another 37 people were sold out of state, which was essentially a death sentence. Sold to the deep south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy for enslaved people was measured in years, not decades. 4 white men were arrested for allegedly helping or encouraging the plot. They were fined, not executed. Fined. White lives had value, even when they committed treason. Black lives had none, even when they sought freedom. July 2, 1822 dawn, Blake's Landing on the Cooper River. A crowd gathered to watch. Denmark Vesey walked to the gallows singing a hymn, his hands bound behind his back, the noose placed around his neck. Before they pulled the lever, he spoke his final words. "Know ye the truth, and the truth shall make you free." John chapter 8, verse 32. Then the platform dropped. Denmark Vesey, 55 years old, carpenter, linguist, revolutionary, died with a Bible verse on his lips. Over the next 6 weeks, 34 more men hanged at the same spot, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Later, cut down, burned ashes scattered. So there would be no graves, no memorials, no place for people to honor them. White Charleston wanted them erased from existence, from earth, from memory, from history. But the city wasn't done. Within hours of Vesey's execution, city officials surrounded the AME Church on Anson Street. Not a mob. City Marshal John J. LaFar personally oversaw the destruction. The building was systematically dismantled, not burned in rage, but demolished with official approval. Every brick scattered, every Bible confiscated and burned, every hymnal destroyed, every membership record seized. The lot was sold to a white buyer within a month. Today, it's a parking lot. No marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate that the most important black church in Charleston history once stood there. Nothing to tell you that this was ground zero for the largest liberation plot in American history before the Civil War. Just asphalt and painted lines. The authorities confiscated everything connected to the plot. The weapons the blacksmiths had made, hundreds of pikes and daggers, publicly destroyed. The maps Vesey had drawn of Charleston with every arsenal and guardhouse marked, burned. Letters between the conspirators burned. Any physical evidence of how organized and sophisticated this movement was erased. Why? Because that evidence proved something white supremacy couldn't allow. It proved black people could organize on a massive scale. It proved literacy was dangerous. Denmark Vesey's ability to read and write in 5 languages had made him deadly. It proved Christianity could inspire revolution. Every single leader was Christian. They used scripture as their rallying cry. White Charleston had spent decades using the Bible to justify slavery, cherry-picking verses about slaves obeying masters. Vesey had used the same Bible to justify liberation, and he'd nearly succeeded. That truth had to be buried. The manhunt continued even after the executions. Morris Brown, the pastor of the AME Church, fled to Philadelphia. Bounties were placed on him and other church leaders who escaped. The homes of free blacks were searched repeatedly for what authorities called seditious materials, Bibles in languages other than English, books about Haiti, any writing that suggested black people deserved freedom. Being caught with the wrong book could get you whipped or sold. Any black person who'd attended the AME Church was put under surveillance for years. White Charleston lived in terror that there might be other cells, other plans, other Denmark Veseys waiting. So they watched, they controlled, they crushed any hint of black autonomy. But here's what you need to understand. Denmark Vesey wasn't unique. His plot wasn't some isolated incident of black resistance that white America could dismiss as an aberration. This was part of a pattern that repeats throughout American history. Every generation, black people organized for freedom. Every generation, white supremacy responded with mass execution, collective punishment, and systematic erasure. Let me show you. 22 years before Vesey, Virginia. August 30th, 1800. Gabriel Prosser, an enslaved blacksmith in Henrico County, organized approximately 1,000 enslaved people for a march on Richmond. The plan was sophisticated. Take the armory, capture the weapons, hold Governor James Monroe hostage, demand freedom or death. They made hundreds of weapons, turning farm tools into swords, melting pewter into bullets. They set the date August 30th at midnight, but that night the worst storm in Virginia history washed out the bridges leading to Richmond. The attack had to be delayed. In that delay, 2 enslaved men informed their master. Governor Monroe called out the militia. Within days, Gabriel was captured hiding in the hold of a ship. 26 men were hanged, including Gabriel. His last words before the noose haunt history. I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial by them. Think about that. Gabriel saw himself as George Washington, a military leader fighting for his people's freedom. But Washington became the father of our country. Gabriel became a footnote, labeled a rebel. The response in Virginia mirrored Charleston. Stricter slave codes immediately passed. Black preachers banned. Teaching enslaved people to read made illegal. Any gathering of more than 5 black people without a white person present prohibited. The conspiracy was suppressed from Virginia's official history for over 150 years. Textbooks didn't mention Gabriel until the late 1900s. When they finally did, they called it Gabriel's Rebellion, framing him as a criminal rather than a freedom fighter. Same strategy. Execute the leaders, terrorize the community, erase the history. 11 years after Gabriel, Louisiana, January 8 through 10, 1811, the German Coast Uprising, the largest slave revolt in United States history. Between 200 and 500 enslaved people rose up along the Mississippi River, 35 miles from New Orleans. Led by Charles Deslandes, a Haitian-born enslaved driver who'd seen revolution succeed in his homeland. Armed with cane knives, axes, and firearms seized from plantations, they marched toward New Orleans in military formation, drums beating, flags flying, chanting freedom or death in French and Creole. They burned plantation houses as they advanced, killed 2 white men who tried to stop them. Their numbers grew as they marched plantations joining the revolt, until nearly 500 people were moving on New Orleans like an army. The United States Army and local militia crushed them in 2 days. 95 black people killed in battle or executed immediately after capture. Another 44 put on trial and executed. But here's the truly horrific part. The authorities cut off their heads and mounted them on pikes along the river road from New Orleans to the German coast. 60 miles of severed heads, a parade of death designed to terrorize every enslaved person in Louisiana. The message was clear. This is what happens when you fight for freedom. This revolt was so thoroughly deleted from Louisiana history that historians didn't rediscover it until the 1990s. Almost 200 years of silence. 2 centuries of pretending it never happened. Why? Because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that enslaved people organized military campaigns. It meant acknowledging they nearly took New Orleans. It meant acknowledging that slavery required constant terror to maintain. 9 years after Vesey, Virginia, again. August 21st through 23, 1831, Southampton County, Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner was an enslaved preacher who believed God had called him to lead his people to freedom. He had visions, heard voices, saw signs in the sky, solar eclipses, and atmospheric phenomena that he interpreted as divine commands. On August 21st, he and 6 other enslaved men began moving from plantation to plantation, killing white families and recruiting more fighters. Over 48 hours, they killed approximately 55 to 60 white people. Their numbers grew to about 70. The revolt lasted 2 days before militia crushed it. Nat Turner hid for 2 months in the Virginia woods before being captured on October 30th. He was hanged November 11. But the execution wasn't enough. White mobs skinned Nat Turner's body, turned his bones into souvenirs, kept his skull as a trophy that was passed down through a white family for generations. And they didn't stop with him. White vigilantes killed over 200 innocent black people in retaliation. People who had nothing to do with the revolt. Men, women, children murdered in a spasm of racial terrorism. Virginia's response was predictable. The most restrictive slave codes yet. Black preaching banned entirely. Black people couldn't gather for any reason, including church. Teaching black people to read became punishable by whipping. The state tried to erase black literacy entirely. Nat Turner became a symbol in white culture of everything they feared, portrayed as insane, demonic, a monster, rather than a man fighting for freedom. Go back further. September 9th, 1739. Stono, South Carolina, just 20 miles from Charleston. The Stono Rebellion. 20 enslaved Angolans, led by a man named Jemmy, raided a firearms store on the Stono River, armed themselves with guns and ammunition, set out marching south toward Florida. Why Florida? Because Spanish colonial authorities there had promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped British colonies. They marched down the road beating drums, burning plantations, killing white people who tried to stop them. Their numbers grew to between 60 and 100. They made it 10 miles before the militia caught them. Most were killed in battle. Survivors were executed or sold to the Caribbean, which was a death sentence. Caribbean plantations had mortality rates so high that they required constant new imports of enslaved people. South Carolina responded with the Negro Act of 1740, one of the most brutal slave codes in American history, banned drums because they'd been used to communicate during the revolt, banned teaching enslaved people to write, banned enslaved people from growing their own food or earning their own money, making them completely dependent on masters, made it illegal for more than 7 enslaved people to gather without a white person present. These laws stayed on the books for over 120 years. The Stono Rebellion was erased so thoroughly that most South Carolinians today have no idea it happened. Most history classes skip it entirely. But it's the reason South Carolina had the most oppressive slave system in North America. Do you see the pattern now? Gabriel's conspiracy, the German coast uprising, Denmark Vesey's plot, Nat Turner's rebellion, Stono. Every generation fought. Every single generation. The methods were different. The scale varied. The outcomes changed. But the resistance was constant. And every single time the response was identical. Mass execution. Heads on pikes. Bodies skinned. Public torture. Then collective punishment against black people who had nothing to do with the revolt. Then new laws designed to crush any possibility of future resistance. Ban black preaching. Ban black literacy. Ban black gatherings. Make it illegal for black people to exist outside white supervision. And finally, the cruelest weapon, erasure. Remove them from the historical record. Don't teach their names in schools. Reframe them as criminals, rebels, threats, insurrectionists. Never call them what they actually were. Freedom fighters, revolutionaries, warriors. They didn't just kill the revolutionaries. They killed the memory. They wanted future generations of black people to believe resistance was futile. They wanted you to think your ancestors were passive victims who waited for white saviors like Abraham Lincoln to free them. They wanted you to believe armed resistance started in the 1960s with the Black Panthers. They wanted you to forget that fighting for freedom is your inheritance. Every generation before you did it. Gabriel did it. Charles Deslondes did it. Denmark Vesey did it. Nat Turner did it. Harriet Tubman did it. They fought back with everything they had. Some succeeded temporarily. Some failed. None of them quit. And here's what makes the erasure even more insidious. It wasn't just about removing names from history books. It was about destroying the physical evidence so thoroughly that future generations couldn't reconstruct the truth even if they wanted to. Let me show you exactly how they did it. Physical destruction was always the first step. Within hours of Denmark Vesey's execution on July 2, 1822, City Marshal John J. Lafar stood outside the AME Church on Anson Street with a crew of workers and a city ordinance authorizing demolition. This wasn't a mob burning a building in rage. This was official government policy, systematic, methodical, legal. They dismantled the church brick by brick, confiscated every Bible, every hymnal, every piece of paper with a member's name on it, burned them in a pile in the street. The lot was surveyed, cleared, and sold to a white buyer within 30 days. Today, if you go to that location, you'll find a parking lot. No historical marker, no plaque, no acknowledgement that the birthplace of Black liberation theology in America once stood there. Just painted lines and asphalt. The city of Charleston has spent millions preserving colonial buildings and antebellum mansions. They've restored slave markets as museums. But the site where Denmark Vesey planned to free 9,000 people, erased. They burned all the evidence of the conspiracy itself. The weapons the blacksmiths had forged over months, hundreds of pikes and daggers and bayonets, were collected and publicly destroyed. Melted down or broken apart. The maps Denmark Vesey had drawn, showing every arsenal, every guardhouse, every weak point in Charleston's defenses burned. Letters between conspirators discussing strategy and timing and recruitment burned. Any document proving how sophisticated and organized this movement was destroyed. Why? Because preserving that evidence would prove something dangerous. It would prove Black people under slavery weren't helpless. It would prove they could plan military operations with precision. It would prove literacy made them powerful. Denmark Vesey's ability to read and write in English, French, Spanish, Creole, and Hebrew had made him the most dangerous man in South Carolina. That couldn't be allowed to stand as an example. The hunt for anyone connected to the plot continued for years. Morris Brown, the pastor who'd fled to Philadelphia, had a bounty on his head. Other church leaders who'd escaped were tracked. The homes of free Blacks were searched repeatedly without warrants. Authorities were looking for what they called seditious materials, books about Haiti, copies of the Haitian Constitution, anything written in French or Creole, religious texts that emphasized liberation over obedience. Having the wrong book in your home could get you whipped, imprisoned, or sold. Any Black person who'd attended the AME Church, even if they had nothing to do with the plot, was placed under surveillance. White Charleston didn't just want to punish the guilty. They wanted to terrorize the entire Black community into permanent submission. But physical destruction was only phase 1. Phase 2 was legal suppression. Using law itself as a weapon to ensure nothing like Vesey's plot could ever happen again. The laws passed in the immediate aftermath were designed to criminalize Black autonomy in every form. In 1822, within weeks of the executions, South Carolina passed the Negro Seaman Acts. These laws required any Black sailor, even free men from northern states or foreign countries, to be imprisoned while their ships were docked in Charleston Harbor. The reason Denmark Vesey had recruited Black sailors from Haiti and Jamaica, who'd brought news of successful revolutions. The state declared that Black sailors brought dangerous ideas of freedom. Massachusetts sued South Carolina in federal court, arguing the law violated the Constitution's guarantee of free movement between states. South Carolina's response was blunt. We don't care. We will nullify federal law to preserve slavery. And the Supreme Court, dominated by Southern justices, sided with South Carolina. That law stayed on the books until 1865. For 43 years, free black sailors were imprisoned in Charleston simply for existing. In 1834, 12 years after Vesey, South Carolina passed even harsher laws. All black churches were banned entirely, not regulated, banned. Black people could only worship in white-controlled congregations under white supervision. Black preachers were outlawed. A black man could not lead, worship, could not give a sermon, could not teach Bible study. Any gathering of more than 5 black people for religious purposes without a white person present was illegal. The state legislature explicitly cited the Vesey plot as justification. They argued that the AME Church had been a training ground for insurrection. That Bible study had been cover for military planning. That black Christianity, when practiced independently, was inherently dangerous. The message was clear. Your faith is only acceptable when it teaches obedience, when it keeps you quiet, when it makes you wait for freedom in heaven instead of fighting for it on earth. These laws remained in force until the end of the Civil War. The AME Church didn't return to Charleston until 1865, and even then faced constant harassment. The literacy bans were equally brutal. South Carolina made it a criminal offense to teach enslaved people to read or write. The punishment: up to 100 lashes for the student and 6 months imprisonment for the teacher. Free black children were banned from attending schools. Why? Because Denmark Vesey's education had made him lethal. His ability to read revolutionary texts, to study military strategy, to communicate across language barriers, had enabled him to organize thousands. The state decided that black literacy itself was a threat that had to be eliminated. For over 30 years, from 1834 until the Civil War, an entire generation of black South Carolinians was systematically denied education by law. The long-term effects of that are incalculable. How many potential leaders never learned to read? How many revolutionary minds were stunted? How many Denmark Veseys were prevented from emerging because they never got the tools of literacy? But legal suppression was only phase 2. Phase 3 was educational erasure. Controlling the narrative, rewriting history in real time. The Charleston newspapers in August 1822 were ordered to provide only sanitized accounts of the plot. The Charleston Courier, the main paper, ran stories emphasizing the loyalty of the house slaves who'd informed on Vesey, portrayed the plot as a conspiracy by a small group of radicals influenced by foreign agitators. They emphasized Denmark Vesey's Caribbean birth, making him sound like an outside troublemaker, rather than a man who'd lived in Charleston for over 20 years. They minimized the numbers, claiming only a handful of people were actually involved. Never mentioned the 9,000 figure that the court documents clearly showed. Framed the entire event as proof that educating black people led to danger. The northern newspapers relied on Charleston sources for their information, so they reprinted the same sanitized version. By the time news of the plot reached Boston or New York, it had been filtered through the lens of white Southern propaganda. The city of Charleston published an official report in October 1822 titled An Account of the Late Intended Insurrection, written by Lionel Henry Kennedy and Thomas Parker, the 2 magistrates who'd sentenced Denmark Vesey to death. This wasn't a neutral historical document. This was propaganda designed to justify what they'd done. It portrayed Vesey as delusional, irrational, a man driven mad by reading too much. It portrayed the plot as poorly organized and easily stopped. It portrayed the executions as regrettable, but necessary. This became the only official record. For decades, anyone researching the Vesey plot had to rely on this document written by the men who'd killed him. Imagine if the only record of the American Revolution was written by King George's generals. That's what happened here. Throughout the 19th century, most American history textbooks didn't mention Denmark Vesey at all. Zero. Nothing. When textbooks did mention slave resistance, they focused on Nat Turner because his revolt involved killing white people, which let white historians portray all slave resistance as savage and irrational. Denmark Vesey's plot was harder to spin that way because it never reached the violent stage, so they just omitted it. School children in South Carolina grew up never learning that the largest liberation plot in their state's history had been planned in Charleston. Northern textbooks barely mentioned it, maybe a sentence calling it a slave conspiracy in Charleston that was discovered before it could be carried out. No names, no details, no context. This continued through the Jim Crow era, through the first half of the 20th century, even into the civil rights movement. Most activists in the 1960s had never heard of Denmark Vesey. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians began serious work to recover the full story, and even the language they used was a weapon. Conspiracy versus liberation movement, plot versus revolution, rebellion versus war for freedom. These words aren't neutral. When you call something a conspiracy, you make it sound illegitimate, secretive, criminal. When you call someone a conspirator instead of a revolutionary, you make them sound like a threat instead of a hero. Think about the American Revolution. George Washington conspired against the British Crown. He planned in secret. He organized armed resistance. He led military attacks against the established government. We call him a founding father. Denmark Vesey conspired against slavery. He planned in secret. He organized armed resistance. He prepared military attacks against the established government. They called him an insurrectionist. Same actions, different words. Why? Because one was white and won, the other was black and lost. History is written by the victors, and the language they choose shapes how we remember. But the most effective suppression was media manipulation. Not just newspapers, but the entire cultural narrative. White Charleston in 1822 had to explain to itself why this had happened. How could their slaves, who they'd convinced themselves were happy and loyal and childlike, have organized something? This sophisticated, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. So they created alternative explanations. Denmark Vesey must have been insane. He must have been influenced by foreign radicals from Haiti. He must have manipulated simple-minded slaves who didn't really understand what they were doing. The house slaves who informed must have been the true heroes, loyal servants protecting their masters. This narrative spread through sermons, through speeches, through plays and literature. It became the accepted story. By the 1830s, white Southerners had convinced themselves that slavery was a positive good, that enslaved people were better off than free blacks in the North, that slave resistance only happened when outside agitators stirred up trouble. Denmark Vesey became proof of this narrative. See what happens when you let them learn to read. See what happens when you let them gather without supervision. The plot was reframed as a cautionary tale, justifying more oppression. The trial transcripts themselves were edited before publication. The official version published by Kennedy and Parker removed testimony that made Vesey look heroic, removed references to the biblical passages he cited to justify resistance, removed his eloquent self-defense, where he'd quoted legal precedent and exposed contradictions in witness testimony. For 180 years, that edited version was the only official record available to historians. The original trial transcripts either destroyed or lost. In the 1970s, some historians began arguing the plot might not have existed at all. They claimed white Charleston had exaggerated or fabricated the conspiracy to justify repression of the black community. Why would scholars argue this? Because acknowledging Denmark Vesey means acknowledging that enslaved people mounted sophisticated, organized resistance. It means acknowledging that slavery required constant terrorism to maintain. It means acknowledging that the passive obedient slave was a myth created by enslavers. Some white historians found it easier to deny the plot existed than to face those truths. Now let me connect this directly to your life today. Let me show you why this 203-year-old story matters right now in 2025. Because this isn't ancient history sealed off in the past. This is the foundation of everything you're experiencing right now. The wealth gap, the criminalization of black churches that get political, the attacks on black education, the surveillance of black organizing. The pattern didn't end in 1822. It evolved. Start with the church. In 1822, the AME Church in Charleston was the center of revolutionary organizing. In 2015, Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, the same church tradition that grew from the ashes of Vesey's church, became the target of a white supremacist terrorist. Dylan Roof walked into a Wednesday night Bible study on June 17, 2015, sat with the congregation for an hour, then pulled out a gun and murdered 9 people: Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson. 9 people killed during Bible study. Roof explicitly said he chose a church because he understood that black people use churches to organize. He said he wanted to start a race war. He targeted that church because he knew, its history knew, it represented black resistance, knew it was dangerous to white supremacy. Same city, same church tradition, same strategy of attacking black religious autonomy, 193 years apart. And the surveillance continues. During the civil rights movement, the FBI's COINTELPRO program infiltrated black churches, planted informants in congregations, tapped phones of ministers, tried to destroy Martin Luther King Jr. by threatening to expose his personal life, tried to get him to commit suicide. Why? Because black churches were organizing voter registration drives, sit-ins, boycotts. They were centers of resistance, just like Denmark Vesey's church. The federal government treated them as threats to national security. In the 1980s and 90s, black liberation theology was labeled radical and anti-American. When Reverend Jeremiah Wright's sermons were publicized during the 2008 election, he was portrayed as dangerous and extreme for preaching about systemic racism and American imperialism. He was doing what black preachers have always done, connecting faith to justice, but the media treated it as scandalous. Today, black churches that engage in political organizing face threats from the IRS about losing tax-exempt status. The message is the same as 1834. Your faith is only acceptable when it doesn't challenge power. Now let's talk about money. Denmark Vesey was a free man who had accumulated significant wealth. After his execution, all his property was seized. His carpentry business, his tools, his home, everything he'd built, taken by the state. His family got nothing. Every one of the 35 men executed in 1822 had their labor and accumulated property benefit the people who'd enslaved them or the state that killed them. The 37 people sold away generated wealth for their new enslavers. Calculate the minimum stolen value. 35 executed men average value per enslaved person in 1822 was between $400 and $600. That's at least $14,000 in 1822 money. Adjust for inflation and compound interest over 203 years, over $2 million in today's money. And that's just the human capital, not counting Denmark Vesey's actual accumulated wealth, his property, his business assets, all stolen, all transferred to white hands. And this happened after every slave revolt. After Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia, all the property of the executed men went to their enslavers. After Nat Turner's rebellion, his enslaver was compensated by the state for losing his property. Compensated for losing Nat Turner, the freedom fighter's enslaver got paid. After every revolt, Southern states compensated white slave owners for their losses. The white enslavers got reparations. The black freedom fighters got nothing. Their families got nothing. Their descendants got nothing. This is why reparations aren't a handout. This is why the wealth gap isn't about personal responsibility or work ethic. It's theft. Systematic legal intergenerational theft. The median white household in America today has $188,000 in wealth. The median black household has $24,000. That's not an accident. That's not because black people don't work hard. That's because every time black people built wealth, it was stolen. Denmark Vesey built wealth. Stolen. After the Civil War during Reconstruction, black people accumulated an estimated $20 million in property, equivalent to $500 million today. They created 4,000 schools. They elected officials to every level of government. They built businesses and bought land. Then came the counter-revolution, the Ku Klux Klan, the white riots in Memphis in 1866, New Orleans in 1866, Wilmington in 1898, the massacres in Rosewood, Florida in 1923, Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, Elaine, Arkansas in 1919. Every time black people built wealth, white supremacist terrorism destroyed it. And the wealth was transferred to white hands. Tulsa is the clearest example. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa was called Black Wall Street. Over 300 black-owned businesses, black doctors, lawyers, teachers, shop owners, more black millionaires per capita than anywhere in America. The neighborhood had its own movie theaters, schools, hospitals, newspapers. On May 31, 1921, a white mob numbering in the thousands attacked Greenwood. They burned 35 city blocks. They dropped firebombs from airplanes. They murdered at least 300 black people. Every single building destroyed. Every business burned. And here's what they don't teach you. After the massacre, the city of Tulsa changed the fire codes, made it impossible for black people to rebuild without permits they would never be granted, changed zoning laws. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot exclusions in the policies. The land was seized for unpaid taxes and sold to white developers. The wealth of Greenwood was systematically transferred to white ownership. If those families still owned that land today, they'd be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That wealth gap you see today, it's not natural, it's stolen inheritance. And it continues right now. Gentrification is modern land theft. Black neighborhoods in cities across America, neighborhoods that survived urban renewal and redlining, are now being gentrified. Property taxes raised until longtime residents can't afford them. Black homeowners forced to sell. White developers buy the land cheap and build luxury condos. The descendants of people who survived slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination are being pushed out of neighborhoods their families built. This is the same pattern. Black people build, white people take. The law protects the taking. In Brooklyn, in Harlem, in Oakland, in Atlanta, in Washington, D.C., it's happening right now. Mass incarceration is modern slavery. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. Except that exception has been used to re-enslave millions of black people. Policies like the 1994 crime bill, 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, the war on drugs, all designed to funnel black people into prisons where their labor is exploited for pennies an hour. Private prison corporations make billions. States use prison labor to make products. Angola Prison in Louisiana, built on a former plantation, still uses prisoners to pick cotton. Still, in 2025, the largest maximum security prison in America, on land where enslaved people once worked, using prisoners disproportionately black to harvest the same crop. The system didn't end, it evolved. Police brutality is modern slave patrols. Before the Civil War, southern states had slave patrols, armed white men authorized to stop any black person and demand proof of freedom. Free blacks had to carry papers at all times. Enslaved people caught without permission from their master were whipped or killed. After the Civil War, those slave patrols became police departments. The first formal police forces in the South were created specifically to control newly freed black people. Today, black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Driving while black is still a crime in practice. Being in the wrong neighborhood, existing in a way that makes white people uncomfortable. The justification is always the same. Officer safety, perceived threat. He looked suspicious. The same language used to justify slave patrols. Denmark Vesey was a free man who'd committed no crime. He was arrested for his thoughts, for his plans, for what authorities feared he might do. Trayvon Martin was killed for walking home. Michael Brown for walking in the street. Breonna Taylor for sleeping in her home. The threat isn't what black people do. The threat is black people existing outside white control. Now here's the part where I need you to really hear me. You are not victims. You hearing this story, learning what happened to Denmark Vesey, understanding the pattern of theft and erasure, you are not helpless. You are survivors of genocide. Your ancestors survived the Middle Passage. They survived 250 years of slavery. They survived Reconstruction and the betrayal that ended it. They survived Jim Crow. They survived domestic terrorism, lynching massacres, legal oppression. They survived all of that and still built wealth, still created culture, still fought for freedom. You exist because they refused to be broken. That strength is in your DNA. You are descendants of warriors. Denmark Vesey was a warrior. Not with guns only, though he prepared for that. He was a warrior of the mind. He learned 5 languages when it was illegal. He studied military strategy. He organized thousands of people in secret. He planned a revolution with precision. Peter Poyas was a warrior who went to his death silent, revealing nothing, even under torture. Rolla Bennett was a warrior who risked everything, even though he had relative comfort as a house slave. Your ancestors were warriors. Every single generation produced people who said no more, who organized, who resisted. You come from that. You are heirs to stolen empires. Denmark Vesey built a successful carpentry business. After his death, it was stolen. Your ancestors built Greenwood in Tulsa. It was stolen. They built thriving neighborhoods in Wilmington, North Carolina, in Rosewood, Florida, in Elaine, Arkansas. All stolen. They accumulated land during Reconstruction. Stolen through legal manipulation, through violence, through fraud. The poverty you might experience isn't your fault. It's not your parents' fault. It's not because anyone in your family line failed. It's because what you should have inherited was stolen. And the theft continues. But knowing this changes everything, because now you know what's owed. Now you know the fight isn't about asking for help. It's about demanding what was stolen. Let me reframe your identity. You are not poor. You are stolen from. You are not disadvantaged. You are owed. You are not asking for reparations as charity. You are demanding repayment of a debt. The United States government and the states that practiced slavery and the corporations that profited from it Owe your family line hundreds of thousands of dollars, at minimum, more likely millions. That's not exaggeration. Economists have calculated the stolen value of slave labor. 40 acres and a mule was promised to freed people in 1865. Never delivered. If the government had kept that promise, if your ancestors had received that land and been able to pass it down, your family would be wealthy today. The land alone would be worth millions. You are not asking for a handout. You are demanding justice. Your poverty wasn't your fault. It was stolen. Your lack of generational wealth isn't because your great-grandparents didn't work hard. It's because what they built was destroyed. Denmark Vesey worked hard. He was free. He had money. He had property, all taken. Your ancestors who survived Tulsa worked hard. They were doctors and lawyers and business owners. Everything burned, nothing repaid. This isn't ancient history. There are people alive right now whose grandparents survived the Tulsa massacre. People alive whose parents were denied GI Bill benefits after World War II because of their race. People alive who were redlined out of home ownership in the 1960s and 70s. The theft is recent. The effects are current. The debt is due. Now let me tell you about ancestral pride. Denmark Vesey spoke 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Creole, Hebrew. 5 languages, self-taught, no formal education, no tutors, no language apps. He learned by listening, by reading whatever books he could find, by practicing in secret, because learning was dangerous. Peter Poyas organized a military operation involving thousands of people with precision that would impress modern generals. Monday, Gell coordinated recruitment across plantation lines, navigating the complex social hierarchies slavery created. Gula Jack connected African spiritual practices to Christian liberation theology, creating a syncretic faith that empowered rather than pacified. These were brilliant men, sophisticated thinkers, master strategists, and they did all this while enslaved or recently freed, with no formal education, with every system designed to keep them ignorant and powerless. This is your heritage, not poverty, not ignorance. Genius under oppression. Your ancestors weren't sitting around waiting to be saved. They were building liberation. They were learning. They were organizing. They were planning. And they nearly won. Think about that. Denmark Vesey almost freed Charleston. If not for 2 informants, if not for that betrayal, 9,000 people would have walked free in July 1822. Charleston would have been the first major American city liberated by Black revolutionaries, 30 years before the Civil War, 40 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. Imagine that alternative timeline. Imagine if Vesey had succeeded. Imagine if Charleston had remained free. Imagine if that success had inspired revolts across the South. The entire trajectory of American history would have changed. That's how close your ancestors came. And here's what they couldn't kill. The spirit of resistance. The AME Church that Denmark Vesey helped build still exists. Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston reopened after Dylann Roof's terrorist attack. They still hold Wednesday night Bible study, still organizing, still preaching liberation, still demanding justice. Denmark Vesey's church was demolished in 1822. By 1865, it was rebuilt. Dylann Roof murdered 9 people in 2015. The church reopened and is stronger than ever. You cannot kill the spirit. You can burn the building. You can kill the leaders. You can pass laws. You can erase the history. But the spirit of Black resistance survives. It survived the Middle Passage. It survived slavery. It survived Jim Crow. It will survive whatever comes next.